Thank you, Minister, for the great speech. Sounded like a bit of an election campaign launch in my mind, but I thought I might be a bit cheeky and ask the first question, and then I'll move to the floor. A reminder, delegates, raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Keep it to a question, no comments, please. And if you have already asked a question during Congress, maybe lower your hand and let other delegates ask some questions. My question was, you alluded to pay transparency, Minister. I was wondering, can you speak any more around that?
Yes, yeah, certainly. Look, this is a really critical area, and it's one that we're committed to making progress in. It's now in the formal delegation of Priyanka Radhakrishnan as the Associate Minister who will be taking that work forward. Some of you might be aware that earlier on this year we set up a select committee inquiry into pay transparency to get the ideas on the table, to really shape up a problem definition and to look at what's been working and maybe not working so well internationally in respect of pay transparency regimes that have been set up there. They produced a report which has been really, really useful for us to consider as a government, and we're just sort of formalising and finalising our response in that area. But some of the early thinking at this stage is that I think that there could be some significant value in us drawing together a leadership group, a bit like we did with modern slavery, to really work through what a robust and meaningful framework for pay transparency might be, including the possibility of there being legislative requirements in that area. This is the kind of area where my view is that if we're going to do it, we really need to do it right. There are lots of reporting regimes that you have in this sort of area around the world where the evidence is not necessarily strong that they have actually driven a meaningful change. And so if I can go back to the example of modern slavery, the model that we are developing there is not just a reporting one, it is one that will actually have a due diligence function in it and actually put requirements on organisations to be showing that they're actually doing things that lead to a change instead of just passively reporting. And so I think those are the kind of things that we'll need to work through if we want to have a meaningful pay transparency regime. And there are also other complex questions in the mix. So we've generally focused on gender in respect of pay transparency and the gap that we need to close there. But there are also significant ethnic pay gaps. It becomes more complex around how we measure and take action there, but we need to make sure that that's part of the conversation as well. So Minister Radhakrishnan will be taking that forward, and it's another one of those areas where I expect we'll be able to provide greater clarity on the next steps by around about the end of this year.
Thank you, Minister. I'm going to hand over to Pania. I think you've got a question from the top floor. Top table, should I say? Pania.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister, for talking to us today about fair pay agreements. The sector I work in, the NGO sector, social services, will really benefit from these. Our terms and conditions are very low. Another mechanism the PSA has been using to lift our pay has been through pay equity claims. My employer, along with 4 other employers, has just settled the NGO social services social workers claim, and we are now waiting on Cabinet to sign the drawdown off for this claim. Are we able to count on you to help expedite this in Cabinet?
Hey, well, thank you. And firstly, just acknowledging your mahi and moving forward with that claim. This is not fast work, as you know better than anyone. It requires a lot of engagement, a lot of working through the evidence, and then ultimately a process of sitting down and bargaining out how that might apply. So firstly, I congratulate you and your members for your resilience and patience as you've moved through to this point. With any of these claims, you can absolutely count on my support for that. We want to move these through as quickly as we reasonably can in order to ensure that the benefits of pay equity, which ultimately are about addressing historic injustices, are put in place as soon as possible. So with my colleagues, we certainly will be working through that as fast as we can.
Thank you. Just the order I've seen hands go up, I'm going to go over this side, then to that side. So first question over here.
Kia ora, Minister. Stacey Muir from the DHB sector. I was really glad to hear you mention health reforms earlier in your talk. Sadly, on the front line, we've seen very little change from the health reforms. We still have unrealistically high workloads, unaddressed health and safety issues, and I'm just wondering when the government will push to actually see some meaningful change in that space that includes a worker voice, because we're not seeing that currently.
Hey, well, thank you for the question. And obviously, it's disappointing if we're not seeing those changes coming through. Obviously, I don't sit across the health portfolio, but it's one that I pay a keen interest in because it is so critical to the well-being of so many people in our country. And ultimately, the system will only work and only deliver what it needs to if the workforce is engaged and is well supported. I think there are multiple things at play here. Firstly, there's a set of questions about resourcing across the system, and that is something where we have continued as a government to put record resourcing into the health sector, and that is a track subject to budget decisions that I expect us to continue. We've had significant historic underfunding over the years. You'll know all of the stats better than I do about the paltry increases across both operating and CapEx that were put in by the previous government, and we have now invested to a record level, over $20 billion per year, now going into the sector with additional resource over the next 4 years to support the reform process. And it shouldn't just kind of leave us where we are. It should make things better off. But I think the second point is about how Health New Zealand forms up and what happens internally to ensure that the dialogue, the constructive dialogue with the workforce is there and that it's at the right levels within the organisation. So that's obviously, it's not something I'm particularly close to from a portfolio point of view, but as a government it will be our expectation that that is happening, and it's certainly something, I'm seeing the shaking of the head, that I'm happy to raise directly with the Minister of Health to ensure that he's got a line of sight into the concerns that you're expressing.
Thank you. Question over here, and then I'll go into the middle table at the front.
Yeah, hi, I'm Marcus Hutching and I'm representing the Deaf and Disability Network, but also I'm with the CP community sector as well. I'm a support worker, and we're just going through our fair pay agreement and they've just agreed to negotiate. Some of the things that we are seeing is in our sector, low working conditions, unfair pay, travel, and also protection of disability. So I identify as someone with a disability, and there is no real working protection for disability in our sector. And I would like to know what the government is going to do about that, and also whether the fair pay agreements will be sorted out rather quickly rather than taking a long time.
Well, thank you for your question and for your work in the care sector, which I know has been, at the best of times, a challenging area to work, let alone with some of the challenges over the last couple of years that you will have experienced. And it's one of those sectors where it seems to me that there are multiple issues at play. There's been an issue of historic underfunding. There's an issue of the funded nature of the sector, where it's sort of so kind of second-hand, the relationship between the funder and often what's actually happening at grassroots level. And then there's the disaggregated nature of the sector, where different providers are often competing for contracts, and sometimes, in my observation, the pay and conditions of workers have kind of been one of the things that's been traded off in the mix there. And so while it's not for me to say where a fair pay agreement will apply, that will be for workers and unions to determine, it does seem to me that it is one of those sectors where kind of the conditions and the drivers for a fair pay agreement would appear to be there. And so I would have thought that FPAs as a tool are potentially one of the ways of moving forward and addressing those issues that you have just identified. One of the things that we're trying to be really clear about with FPAs is that they're not just kind of a haggle about what the pay agreement, the pay deal will be for next year. They're purposefully set to be a bit longer term in nature. Now, you'll know that collectives can be between 1 and 3 years. FPAs will be between 3 and 5 years. So they're kind of about lifting everyone's sights a little bit to really say, what are the issues in the sector? What's holding us back? How can we really problem solve around the stuff and put in place some plans that actually move us from where we are to where we need to be? And so whether it's issues with historic underfunding, a lack of training and support, entrenched health and safety weaknesses, those are issues that I would expect would be on the table in fair pay agreements in a way that's maybe a little bit more than they historically have been with collective agreement negotiations. So I would think that they would be an excellent forum, and because you can potentially, through FPAs, have everyone there at the table, not just one employer, but actually a sector there's actually an ability to start developing up a sector response to those problems. And what we have also built into the Fair Pay Agreement architecture is that where there's a funded sector, there will need to be a direct line through from the people who are at the table to the funder, whether it's central government or local government, so that as the conversations are occurring about what needs to happen, there can also be a conversation around what the funding needs to be to meet those outcomes. So I would hope that can be a good pathway for your sector.
Thank you. We'll go to here, Sonia.
Kia ora, Sonia Lister, representing Women's Network. A few weeks ago, we had our Women's Network conference, and Minister Jan Tinetti came along, and she kindly shared some statistics around how, since COVID, women and children are still struggling to access work and education. And whilst your kōrero today talked about, reducing poverty and changes to climate change, and we thank and acknowledge the government for reducing public transport by 50%. Has there been any consideration of making it free for women and children to help and aid access to work and also education, and to help reducing that poverty and climate change?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, kia ora, and firstly to the Women's Network, happy Suffrage Day, which I think would have been on the first day of your Congress. This is an area that we continue to work on. We've got a really interesting and challenging situation across public transport, where we have an urgent need to support more people to be able to use public transport. If we want to meet the climate challenge, if we want to have cleaner air in our towns and cities, if we want to reduce congestion, we need more people to use public transport. And so that the questions that we face are, given the resources that we have, what are the things that we can do that get us there as quickly as we can? And I think some of it does need to be around fares. So that's why the half price move has been really important this year. We have permanently funded beyond that a targeted approach. So folks who are on a community services card, so linking it effectively to low income, will have permanent half price public transport from January of this year. We retain an open mind about whether there's a good justification for extending that further. It is one of those areas where there is a tension between, do you provide effectively a universal benefit, or do you try and target in the dollars to the people who really need it? I mean, I'm a regular bus user. I don't really need a targeted subsidy there. But across public transport, the challenge we face is that we could put a lot of money into fares, but there's a huge amount of other stuff. So actually the biggest crisis we have at the moment in public transport are the pay and conditions of bus drivers. So we've actually got services in Auckland and Wellington in particular, where every single day services are having to be cancelled because we've inherited the disastrous public transport operating model from the previous government, which has driven pay and conditions into the ground. Lo and behold, drivers aren't going to work for peanuts. And so we don't have enough drivers to keep the services going, let alone to expand it. So the immediate pressure point and focus in terms of funding actually has to be on plugging that problem and making sure that terms and conditions are good enough that we can grow public transport services. And then the other key area, the evidence probably tells us that in terms of transport equity, and this applies particularly for women, young people, Māori and Pacifica, probably almost ranking above fares is actually just the accessibility of services. We often do not have good and accessible and frequent services going into the parts of town where people really need good public transport. So we've got a $350 million transport choices package that we're talking to local government about at the moment that's about addressing that. So I think it'll be across all of those areas that we'll try and address the equity piece, but we do acknowledge that fares do have a role to play there.
Thank you. Just down the back, I think you've got a microphone already. Then we'll go over this side, if we can get a microphone there, and then the far back, we'll go there next.
Hi, it's Shivangi Naidu from Public Service. I've got a question with regards to pay freeze, which was announced for the government support or workers in total. Luckily, where I work, we had a collective in place where we were entitled to get SP our collective. However, our collective is finishing this year and will be entering into bargain. So how will the government support us with our bargaining with our employer in terms of the pay freeze? Would that be a hindrance to our collective?
Okay. Hey, thank you for the question. I obviously won't get into the details of what might happen in your individual bargaining. That'll be something that the PSA and the employer will need to work through in good faith at the table. But probably really important to address the question around pay freeze and pay restraint. So the first really important point to make is that despite some of the media rhetoric around this, there is not a government pay freeze edict that is in place. There is a pay restraint policy which is in place, but there is not a pay freeze policy that is in place. And across many of your bargainings over the last year or two, that will have been evident. The pay restraint policy, to a very large degree, is about how we move forward with our agenda to make pay fairer across the public service and to try and really hone in with the resources that we have, the needs in particular of low to medium pay workers as much as possible. Because what we see across the public service as much as parts of the private service is that we actually have relatively large numbers of workers who have often been stuck on very low pay and conditions for quite a long time. And I think sometimes people have got a picture in their head that low pay is only a private sector issue. As many of you know, low pay can be a real public sector issue as well. And so the pay restraint guidelines specifically steer public sector employers in bargaining to focusing in particular on the needs of low to medium pay workers, and potentially looking at putting differential resource in there to plug the gap and bring those workers up. So in terms of the approach that your employer takes, those are the sort of general guidelines there. They have flexibility within that to bargain in good faith with you, and they also have flexibility to talk with the Public Service Commissioner if they think that there needs to be extra flexibility brought in to make sure that that's a fair and good bargaining outcome.
Thank you. I think someone's got the microphone there, and then we're going right to the far back corner. You get a microphone there.
Richard Keelan, te runanga o nā toa āwhina. Te mea tuatahi e mihi atu ki a koe te minita mo i tō mahi ki te whakapiki nā kaimahi i roto i Aotearoa. My pātai at our recent Hui Taumata, one of the themes that was running through the room was about equality of wages across the public sector. So people in like work getting paid the same, because we have fluctuations in what our people maybe in corrections receive as opposed to other ministries, and it's been that way for a while. Ne? So is there anything in place to address that across all our agencies?
Hey, thank you for the question. There's certainly the best person who could talk much more about this would, of course, be Chris Hipkins as the Minister of the Public Service, who's been doing a lot of work and thinking in this area. But the answer is that broadly, yes, the government does recognise this issue, and it goes a little back to the conversation we were just having about the guidelines that are in place for bargaining, and that we recognise that across the broader public service and sector that there are real inequalities that are at play, sometimes between male and female dominated occupations, sometimes that play out substantially along ethnic lines, sometimes that are just as a result of historic differences between the way that agencies have gone about their business, and that can't be justifiable and isn't consistent with our values. And so the work that we're doing through the guidelines that we've given for bargaining, but also the broader work that Minister Hipkins is doing and engaging at senior levels with the PSA around how we don't try and be, I don't want to tie down the language here, but how we move towards pay and conditions that are more fair and more unified across the public service, I think is a really important piece of work if we want to make sure that there is fairness for all workers across the sector. Now that is a big piece of work. You'll know how many different agreements and how many different employment relationships and how many different sets of historic circumstances there are between the PSA and different public service employers. But I think to address your issue, that is a very important thing that we take up.
Thank you. Back corner.
Kia ora, Minister. Marianne Gilbert from the State Sector Committee. Thanks for coming back. I was here at the last Congress. My question is, so I've worked in the state sector the last 15 years. It's been really great, wonderful change from the public service, which was my first half of my career. And I'll say that because there's underfunding, under-resourcing, people are being overworked, people are being bullied, and that's just become part of the job. The government writes the legislation and the best practice for each of these things to do with employment. Why are they not holding their own departments accountable to be the best practice employers? If you're not going to do it yourselves, how can you expect anyone else to do it? Thank you.
Thank you. Look, thank you for the question, and firstly, I'm really sorry to hear that that is the experience that you're having. That is not what we would want and expect from any employer, let alone employers that ultimately are paid by the government. It's an important area for us, and you'll be aware of the reforms that Minister Hipkins took forward to the Public Service Act, which elevated our expectations around what we expect from our agencies to be good employers. So at the highest level in the legislation that governs the state sector and the broader public service, that is our expectation that is set down in statute. Then effectively at the next level, I think there is an issue there about the role of ministers. Ultimately, there's the old US President Harry Truman had the sign on his desk which said the buck stops here. And ultimately we are responsible for our departments and agencies and how they conduct themselves and their relationships with the workforce. So I can, in my areas, that is a constant topic of conversation because A, we need to be treating our workforces in a way that's consistent with our values as a government, and B, if we want to deliver the outcomes for New Zealanders, we're simply not going to do that if we don't have workforces who are engaged and respected and feeling good about the work that they do. So I think that is a reasonable question you ask. It is something that ministers at ministerial level need to keep as close an eye on as possible, and to be really clear with chief executives and boards about what our expectations are. And I would, through the formal channels that we have, really invite clarity about where you are seeing the particular issues, so that we as ministers can take them up at the highest levels within your organisations.
Thank you. We are out of time now, so any further questions you had, I'd encourage you to email the Minister directly. I'm sure he'll be keen to respond within 24 hours. Minister...
Put something on the gram.
Yeah.
Yep.
Just one final question. Could you give us a comment on the public service pay adjustment process that's currently underway, and your thoughts, ideas, feelings, and maybe timelines, all those sort of things?
Talk about putting me on the spot there. Thanks very much. Look, you'll be, as everyone is aware, this is a really important process that we have underway between ministers, the Commission, and the PSA and other unions across the public service. We are entering into this process with real intent and good faith, because we believe that if collectively, if we can land it, we think that is good for everyone. It'll provide certainty for workers across the public service at a time when we know there is real pressure in terms of cost of living. It'll enable us, I think, potentially, if we can kind of square that issue away, potentially to focus in on some of the other big structural issues that we know are really important in terms of the quality of people's working lives, and many of those have come up in questions today. And let me just say really bluntly and really directly that politically, in terms of us being able to work together and have a settlement across the broader public service, I think would be a really important thing. I made the point earlier on, we have a tight election ahead of us next year, and I think across the broader progressive movement and the Labour movement, we need to be tight if we want the right outcome that's going to deliver for working people, and I think that this process can support that if we land it. As you know, there's a lot of complexity in it. We're not there yet in terms of landing an outcome, and we just need to make sure that everyone remains at the table, works through in good faith, and has that intent, and certainly that is where we're coming from with it.
Thank you, Minister. In my mind, complexity is where good work gets done. So looking forward to carrying on those discussions. I'll hand over to Kerry now for a few final words.
Just wanting to thank you, Minister, and a short, small token of our appreciation. We do acknowledge and appreciate your recognition of community and public service workers, so thank you for acknowledging the work, the very important and hard work and the need for investment in community and public services, and also for your theme about moving forward and talking about how change can be, how we can make improvements. That's really important, and we have got a lot of ideas about how that can be done, and any change that occurs across New Zealand, it needs to be on the back of a really strong investment in community and public services. We know that that will only be the way that we can get successful outcomes to the government's agenda. Also wanting to thank you for your support for pay equity, and very much thanking you for reminding us about the stark choice that we have at the election next year. We have been talking a lot about that today, and we appreciate what you've outlined for us in terms of the choices that we've got and what is at stake. So thank you for joining us. We do appreciate your support and also your really strong advocacy for having workers' voice at every level of decision making. It's very, very pleasing to see the tripartite forums and the engagement opportunities that we have as a union to participate and input into policy decisions. So thank you, Minister.